There are thousands of gaming PC out there to choose from. And if you don't really know what you're looking for, it's incredibly easy to end up buying a terrible gaming PC. So I decided to do things differently. With a budget of around $500, I'm going to build the best gaming PC possible. A system that can play any modern game at 1440p without falling apart. And I'm confident this build will be more powerful than any pre-built PC sitting on a store shelf at this price. So let's break down the parts I chose and see how this PC actually performs in real games. Alright, let's start with the parts list, beginning with the CPU. With a $500 budget, AMD actually gives us a lot of solid options. If you want something quick and simple, and you prefer buying brand new parts, the Ryzen 5 5500 is an easy recommendation. But if your goal is to maximize performance for the money, then looking at the used market makes a lot of sense. A used Ryzen 5 3600 is still very capable for gaming today, especially considering its current price. That said, for this build, I want to go with something more powerful. So I'm stepping up to Ryzen 7. I already have a Ryzen 7 5700G, so I'm going to reuse it here. However, it's worth pointing out that CPU with the G suffix are usually more expensive, even though their CPU performance is basically the same as the non-G versions. Because of that, if you're buying a CPU right now, I'd actually recommend the Ryzen 7 5700 instead. At the moment, this CPU costs around $80, and you still get 8 cores and 16 threads, with a maximum boost clock of up to 4.6 GHz. With specs like this, it offers excellent multitasking performance and great long-term stability. Yes, it also comes with a decent integrated GPU, but for this build, I won't be using it, since I'll be running a dedicated graphics card anyway. Now let's move on to CPU cooling. For this setup, I'm using a 4-heat pipe air cooler, the Johnsbo CR1000. It also comes with RGB lighting, which helps make the case look a bit more colorful and lively. Next up is RAM. And honestly, choosing RAM right now is more difficult than ever. While 8 GB is technically the minimum for gaming today, that's really just the bare minimum, and I don't like running that close to the limit. So instead, I'm going with 16 GB, using two 8 GB Corsair sticks, running at 3200 MHz. I bought both sticks for $90, which I think is a fair deal. Finally, let's talk about storage. I'm choosing an NVMe SSD. While storage doesn't directly affect FPS, it makes a huge difference in boot times and game loading. If you don't care much about load times, a SAI2 SSD will still work just fine. For this build, I went with a 500 GB Lexar NVMe SSD, which I picked up for $38. To connect all of these parts together, I'm using the Asus A320MA motherboard. This is a very familiar board for budget and mainstream builds. The price is quite reasonable. I bought mine for $43. That said, this is a cost-cut-down version. The board only has 2 RAM slots, which actually helps keep the memory traces shorter and simpler. Because of that, it tends to have fewer RAM compatibility issues, especially with early generation Ryzen CPUs, which are known to be a bit picky with RAM. On the downside, the A320 chipset doesn't support CPU overclocking, and its upgrade path is quite limited. So if you're planning to upgrade in the future or want overclocking support, spending a bit more on a B450 motherboard would be a better choice. Next up is the power supply. For this configuration, I'm using a power supply with a real output of 550 watts. The unit I'm using here is a Corsair 550 watts, and it features modular cables, which makes installation much easier. I picked this power supply up quite cheaply, but honestly I bought it a long time ago, so I can't remember the exact price. Thanks to the modular design, cable management is much cleaner and more aesthetically pleasing inside the case. Now let's move on to the part that really determines gaming performance, the GPU. If you want to handle modern games at 1080p or even 1440p, obvious options would be cards like the RRTX 3060 or RTX 3070. However, at the moment their prices are still quite high. This time though, I went with a much more cost-effective option, one that offers performance very close to the RTX 3060. My choice is the RTX 2060 Super 8GB. In real-world terms, this card is cheaper than the RTX 3060, while still offering all the key technologies like ray tracing and DLSS. In pure performance, the RTX 3060 is only about 3% faster, and in actual gameplay, that difference is almost impossible to notice. I bought this RTX 2060 Super for $160. That said, if you want more VRAM, you can always go for the RTX 3060 12GB instead. Finally, let's talk about the case. This time I'm using a case that comes with 3 pre-installed front intake fans. It's a fairly large case, but that's not a problem. It gives us plenty of room for triple fan. I picked this case up on eBay for $20. So now that all the parts have been selected, I'm going to put everything together as quickly as possible. And we're done. The build looks quite colorful, and everything is up and running. Now let's move on to performance testing. Let's start with Fortnite. With this configuration, I'm testing at 1040p, using medium settings and DirectX 12. At these settings, the FPS stays fairly stable at around 100 FPS while moving around. During intense fights with more visual effects, it drops slightly to around 95 frames per second. To maintain that level of performance, the GPU is running at almost full load. Overall, though, the experience feels very smooth and stable. Next up is CS2, still at 1040p with medium settings. With this setup, the FPS stays above 200 frames per second, delivering an extremely smooth and responsive experience. Interestingly, the GPU is only working at around 80% load, but the temperature does climb up to around 80 degrees Celsius. Even so, this configuration clearly handles esports titles like CS2 with ease. Now let's move on to some AAA titles. First, I'm testing Cyberpunk 2077 at 1040p on low settings. With these settings, the FPS sits around 80 frames per second. Even during intense gunfights with lots of effects, the frame rate remains stable. Overall, the system delivers a very smooth and consistent experience in this game. Next, I'm testing a much heavier title, Black Myth Wukong. Since this is a very demanding game, I'm lowering the resolution to 1080p and keeping the settings at low. With this configuration, the FPS stays around 60 frames per second, which is surprisingly stable. The overall experience feels smooth and very playable. Next up is Tomb Raider. I'm playing at 1080p on ultimate settings. At these settings, the FPS stays between 90 and 100 frames per second. Since this is a story-driven title with a lot of visual detail, the GPU does have to work pretty hard. Even so, the experience remains very smooth and stable, with no noticeable frame drops during gameplay. Now let's switch to a more CPU-heavy game, Minecraft. This time I'm playing at 1440p with 32 chunks. At this setting, the FPS ranges from 280 to 300 FPS. Surprisingly, the CPU is only running at around 13% usage. Next, I'm lowering the render distance down to 8 chunks. And here's where things get interesting. The FPS jumps all the way up to around 900 frames per second. Since the Ryzen 7 5700G has very strong single-core performance, CPU usage still stays below 20%. To push things further, I decided to detonate a large amount of TNT blocks. At that moment, the FPS drops to around 80 frames per second, but it quickly recovers back to normal. That shows the system handles sudden CPU spikes quite well. Overall, through all these tests, this configuration proves to be very stable across different types of games. However, to maintain that level of stability, the GPU is often running at full load. On the other hand, the Ryzen 7 5700G performs very comfortably, rarely being pushed too hard. I'm honestly quite impressed with the overall experience on this setup. Once again, these tests show that the RTX 2060 Super is still a very capable mid-range GPU, easily handling games at 1440p with solid performance. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.